This book talk is part of the Class Apps online resource series for K-12 teachers offered by the National Consortium for Teaching About Asia at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm John Zeljo, staff member at NCTA, University of Colorado, and I'll be talking with journalist Eric Fish about his 2015 book, China's Millennials, The Want Generation. As a journalist, he's focused on education, politics, and social issues, especially as they relate to Chinese youth. In his recent book, China's Millennials, he profiles youth from around the country and how they're navigating the education system, the workplace, social issues, and activism. We asked Mr. Fish to talk about the book as a resource for teachers. Can you talk about your goals for writing the book, and did you have a particular audience in mind for the book?
Yeah, so while I was living in China, a lot of the media coverage I saw that dealt with young Chinese, particularly born between about the mid-'80s and mid-'90s, a lot of it I think stuck to certain narratives that I think are becoming a little bit out of date. And I think ever since the Tiananmen movement in '89, after China changed its whole education system, pushing a more nationalistic narrative, and the economy really started to blow up, there started to emerge this idea that young Chinese had become very materialistic on one hand and very nationalistic on the other. So these two things kind of conspired to make them apathetic about any kind of social change, any kind of lofty things in society. But I think that narrative still has some currency, but the more time I spent and the more time that went on and the younger people that started coming of age, I think that narrative really started to be challenged in a lot of ways. I think we're really moving away from that. And then domestically, there's all kinds of stereotypes about young Chinese being spoiled, not having any concept of hardship like older generations faced. But there are a lot of really intense socioeconomic issues really starting to hit young people. So I wanted to explore a lot of that, a lot of the challenges young people are starting to experience in very large number in China. And as far as audience, I wanted to make it a very readable book. I wanted to focus on individual stories to really give people a sense of how these big socioeconomic issues are affecting people. But I also wanted to make it somewhat academic, something that you can use to learn more broadly about these things that are going on in China. So I use footnotes. I link to other readings that people can use. I try to sprinkle stats within. So my hope was that whether you're a student looking for a good read, wanting to keep somebody's attention that may not be so academically focused, but on the other hand, academics who read it can get a greater appreciation for these issues and dig deeper into it if they want to.
We've seen a number of books about contemporary China for general audiences published in recent years. What are some of the aspects that make this book different from those?
I think my focus on the young generation in particular, there have been a lot of really great books that give a lot of good narratives, but I haven't really seen anything that focus on young people in general and trying to encompass all different corners of Chinese society and how young people in particular are going through certain changes. And I think it's true in any society when it's changing as rapidly as China, you feel that most acutely in the young people who are coming of age, being most influenced by the huge changes, and then not having the same baggage that the older generation does. So I really wanted to focus on this millennial generation. Like I said, I tried to do it in a way that is somewhere between a popular, good read and something kind of academic that can be used. So I think that's what makes it different than a lot of other titles.
Since our audience is made up of educators, what can teachers expect from the book, and how do you think they might be able to use it? And do you have any recommendations on sections or stories to which teachers should give special consideration that would work particularly well in the classroom?
So the way I laid out the book, I have it in 4 separate sections. First, looking at the education system, young people going through the college entrance exam, universities, the patriotic education. Then the second section looks at people entering the workforce, so factory workers, white-collar workers, civil servants, and young entrepreneurs. The third section is about, I call coping, which is looking at various social issues that are becoming really intense for young people, like the gender imbalance, sexism, young people flocking towards more spiritual leanings. And then the final section looks at activism, people pushing back against the status quo in various ways, young journalists, that type of thing. And I tried to do it in kind of bite-sized sections. Each chapter looks at a different demographic, a different story. So each chapter, I think, can kind of stand on its own, can be used for particular lessons. So you can kind of pick and choose what you want to look at, whether it be the education system, the economics of China. So I think that's a good way to approach it. And particular sections, I think, that might be of use to teachers. Like the second chapter, I look at the Gaokao entrance exam in China, and I think that kind of gives a good overview of what it's like for young people. I follow a young woman who's struggling to study for this test and all the hardship that entails, and then some young men that failed the test and what that implies for a lot of young people, how critical that test is. And then I sprinkle in statistics, scholarly studies to kind of put these stories in a broader picture. So I think that's a good start, looking at the education system. The section on going to work, chapter 5, I look at factory workers. The same thing, I follow individual stories, but look at where this lies more broadly in China's labor system. The fifth chapter, I look at white-collar workers and how the glut of university graduates is really affecting young people's, where expectations are getting a bit ahead of reality and how things are becoming a lot tougher for them. So I think that's a good section to kind of explore the economics of China. And then the third section is like the gender imbalance. Like, this is a major issue that's confronting China. So there's any kind of interest in demographics and some of the very unique things that have come about because of like China's one-child policy and all the kind of strange social side effects that have come with it. I think that's a good section to focus on. And then the last section about pushing back, just looks at young people pushing back and really challenging this idea that the young generation's pacified. So you want to get a glimpse of really how this different studies and this generation sets itself apart from earlier generations. I think that's a good section to look at.
Teachers have a challenge in conveying a complex view of a very dynamic, constantly evolving China to an audience of students, most of whom have a limited view of the world. Do you have any advice for teachers who use the book to ensure that they're painting an accurate picture of China today? And how did you decide on what to include in the book, that this would paint the accurate, quote-unquote, accurate picture of today's China? It's not so easy, I would imagine.
No, it's not. This is one of the big challenges for anybody trying to capture China, as massive and diverse as that is. So I think when I was writing, one thing I tried to do is stay humble and not pretend that any one work or any one lesson is going to convey an exhaustive picture, a complete picture of China, because I don't think anybody really even knows what the total picture is. So that was my first piece of advice, would be stay humble and really keep emphasizing how diverse China is and how what happens in Shanghai can be a world apart from what happens in Qinghai or Xi'an or like rural Hebei. So what I tried to do, I tried to capture a lot of very diverse segments of Chinese society. This is another thing I kind of noticed when I was writing my book, how a lot of media coverage, a lot of journalists are based in Beijing or Shanghai. So a lot of the portrayal of young people tends to be kind of biased towards urban middle class. So I really tried to encompass a broader swath of society. I tried to get out to the countryside as much as possible, interview rural people, see what their experience was like, because that's still about half of China, the rural part. So I think this is something worth continually reminding people. That's like the pictures you see of the Olympics or in Shanghai. that's very much part of China's story, but the people that are still living very meager existences and like in the countryside with oxen carts, that's still a very big part of Chinese society. So I really tried to capture lots of these broad segments, and I tried to recognize my own limitations and talk to as many experts as I could, as many scholars. I tried to incorporate as many other studies as I could to really give a broad range of insights and different views and incorporate them into one place. So I think it can be a big challenge to relate the enormous complexity. I mean, scholars have spent their entire lives trying to wrap their heads around that. But I think I do try to hit a lot of the big issues that are affecting millions upon millions of people in China. And I think a lot of them really spark curiosity, like what does it mean when a country has 30 million more men than women, which China is the first country in history to have this issue. And I really try to explore what that means. And I think that's something people anywhere can really capture the imagination and like see what the implications of that are. What are the implications when you have expectations in society moving much faster than reality is able to accommodate? What happens when you have a government the way that China is, but people exposed to lots of information, young people who grew up on the same media, the same kind of pop culture that a lot of Americans are used to? What are the similarities and differences between a young 20-year-old Chinese experience growing up compared to the U.S.? I think there are a lot of very interesting similarities and a lot of distinct differences, and I think that's a good way to engage young students, is to compare their experience to what's happening in China. And I think at least people I've talked to find a lot of that very fascinating in how their life experience compares to young Chinese.
Anything that you didn't capture or couldn't capture that you wanted to, that you think would have been helpful to try to understand this dynamic China?
Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at, I mean, my book is called China's Millennials, and depending on how you define that, that's somewhere between 250 and 400 million people. So, of course, there's no way I could hope to capture every aspect of this generation's experience. Yeah, there are a lot of stories that I wish I could have captured, that I could have spent more time on. I wish I could have gotten out into the regions with minority people, because that wasn't something that I got to in my book. But again, that's a huge part of China's situation right now in these far-flung minority regions. I would have liked to have spent more time. My next book is actually on young Chinese who are studying in the United States, and I would have liked to capture their experience when they go back. So that's another key aspect. But yeah, I think I tried to encompass as broad a section of society as I could. But I mean, that is one thing worth reiterating. Just like, I mean, even if you interview 10,000 Americans, that's not going to give you a full view of America. But I really think it's worth emphasizing the individualism that's really taking hold in this young generation in China, and how diverse opinions are, how diverse lifestyles are becoming. And I say that right on the first section, the first page, I think, of my book, is that there are all these very vibrant cultures and subcultures, and that I hope that my work sparks people to look more into these type of things.
The book hasn't been published in China. Do you know how it's been received there?
Yeah, it hasn't been published in mainland China. I don't know that it will. It has a lot of sensitive topics that I don't think would pass the censors. But I have a lot of young Chinese have read it. I submitted it to different people for review, and this was the demographic. Of course, I was most anxious to hear back from Chinese millennials, the demographic that I wrote about. And so far, I've been very pleasantly surprised. I was worried that they would be looking at it very super critically, and I hope that they were, but in every case so far, they've given very good feedback and saying that that it did capture a lot of the things that they grew up with, and that it was very interesting to see that captured from a foreign perspective. This is one thing you kind of struggle with too as an American going into China and trying to tell a story there. And I think that at least the feedback I've gotten, a lot of people have said it's very interesting to have an outside perspective on this, because even within China right now, there is a lot of, you hear this term post-90s, Jiulingho, or post-80s, talking about the young generations and what that means, all the stereotypes that come with it. And I think a lot of young Chinese were happy to see me challenge some of those stereotypes in reading my book. So yeah, I've been pleasantly surprised there.
Finally, can you talk about what you think are the big takeaways from the book? That is, if a teacher were to consider reading the book to learn about China, what he or she will take away from it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the images that come out of China, I think American society in general has started to have a more nuanced view of China, but I think a lot of old images, like of people marching around in Mao suits, still persist, and that's very much a generation or more ago. So I really tried to portray the diversity, the individualism blooming among young Chinese, and how it's fascinating that you can even ask the most sensitive topic where there's maybe a very strict government line, but at the same time ask 10 people their opinion on it among Chinese youth and get 10 different answers. So I really want that to be a big takeaway in how it's very hard to stereotype. We really shouldn't stereotype, generalize. And I hope especially young people reading this book will be emboldened to learn more. There's more and more, hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in the United States now. A lot of the students reading this in the U.S., I think, will encounter Chinese classmates, so I hope it gives them a more nuanced understanding of where they're coming from. Because this is something I hear from Chinese students in the U.S. too, is a lot of times American students don't have a good grasp of where they're coming from when they talk about certain differences between the two countries. But one of the big takeaways, too, I think, is that this blooming individuality, diversity, is really causing a lot of very interesting things to happen in China, where you have you've had this so-called Beijing consensus for about 2 decades, where the government basically said to its populace, stay out of politics and you can get rich. You can have a lot of personal freedoms. Just let us handle the politics and running the country. And I think that bargain has held firm for a long time, but with this generation that's coming up, I think they're not as satisfied with material growth as their parents' generation were. They're starting to want things a lot more, hence the subtitle of the book, The Want Generation. Whether that be a sense of satisfaction in their work, more spiritual things, more of a say in society, more personal freedoms, even political rights. And as I try to portray in the book, a lot of people are sticking their necks out to push for these things. The respect for Big Brother, for authority, is really starting to break down. And on the other hand, you have circumstances economically, socially, that are getting much more difficult in a lot of ways. China's growth is slowing down, and a lot of big problems are starting to crop up. And whenever that happens, it's the young generation that tends to be the most heavily impacted, because they're the ones first entering the workforce, just now trying to find a partner and all of that. So when these two things are starting to intersect, as they are, rising expectations and a tougher reality, that's going to be a very interesting situation to watch unfold in China. I don't pretend to know exactly where that's leading. I don't try to predict the future in this, but I hope it will spark discussion and spark curiosity about what could these trends culminate in.
Thank you, Eric, for talking with us and for the wonderful contribution to the field.
Thank you so much.